We have been formed by the wars of our ancestors. Whenever we acknowledge the significance and magnitude of events like the American Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, or the defeat of the Nazis, we make an historical judgment. Not just about how the past essentially was, wie es eigentlich gewesen in Leopold von Ranke's famous phrase, but about how things might have gone differently. Could Britain have brought the rebel American colonies to heel after the Declaration of Independence? Should Napoleon have refrained from invading Russia in 1812 or adopted an alternative strategy altogether? Is there a plausible version of events in which Adolf Hitler conquers the East, sees off all challenges to his West, and emerges triumphant from the Second World War? With me to talk through these counterfactuals, these enormous what-if questions, is the historian Andrew Roberts, an internationally acclaimed expert on all three world historical conflicts. Now a member of the House of Lords, he sits in Parliament's upper chamber as Baron Roberts of Belgravia. Lord Roberts, welcome to The Forge.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great honour to be on the show.
Some years ago you edited an anthology on what is called counterfactual history. The anthology was called What Might Have Been. And before we get into the particulars of the American Revolution, Napoleon's Russian campaign in 1812, and indeed Hitler's war primarily in the East, what is your response to historians and indeed philosophers who argue that it is illegitimate and worthless to ask what might have been questions when studying the past?
Well, I think they're wrong. Obviously, I wouldn't have edited the book if I didn't. And in that book, I have an introduction explaining why, philosophically and so on, they are wrong. Because actually history is not on predetermined lines. Only Marxists or determinists or the old Whigs think that history is moving anywhere in particular. It's not. It's quite capable of being side tracks, of going back into reverse. It's a much more interesting and complex thing than the determinists would have you believe. And so I think that luck and contingency and so on play an enormous part. And we can tell that from our own lives. You know, if we hadn't gone to that party, we might want to be married to the person we're married to. If we hadn't, checked out that particular website or newspaper for a job, we might not be doing what we're doing. We know that that's the case. And all history is the multiplication by billions of people of individual experiences.
Let's get into it then. So in your recent biography of George III, in Britain it was just called George III, I believe, and I think in America it was called America's Last King, or the Last King of America. You write,
and it was subtitled the most misunderstood monarch. And
that's right.
That was the sort of point I was trying to.
Quite right, yes. And in the service of making that very point, you write, it is ironic that had King George indeed been the ruthless despot that Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson made him out to be, Britain might have won the war. You argue that he could have deployed ruthless and overwhelming tactics that no doubt a genuine tyrant, like Catherine the Great, for instance, would have done, but did not do so. He was rather more gentlemanly in his approach, and so indeed were the generals tasked with fighting the British war effort. So what was Britain's war strategy then to try and bring the colonies to heel?
It was essentially to try and split the New England colonies off from the rest of the 13 colonies, and to go up the Hudson and essentially do that. And it failed because of the loss of Saratoga in the October of 1777, where General Burgoyne had to surrender with his entire army. Had that not happened, it's perfectly possible that strategy might have come off.
I see. Do you think that a more deft strategy could have been adopted short of using the sort of brutal tactics that indeed many of the American colonists thought that would be used? Because I think Franklin at one point quipped that we must all hang together, or to be sure we should all hang separately. Franklin, you think, was probably wrong to think that the British would be quite as vindictive as all that.
Oh yes, there was no question that we were not going to hang the founding fathers. No. Yeah. But you have to say that in a war. You know, that this is the point about wars, is you have to use every bit of political propaganda you can. I personally think that was a joke of Franklin's, but obviously the things that were said about George III in the Declaration of Independence, which had 28 charges against him, only 2 of which have any validity. That is another classic example of how if you're fighting a war, you grab at every opportunity you have.
And could a more deft strategy, you think, was the strategy that we were adopting good on paper, or could a more deft one have been adopted?
Well, we never had enough men.
Okay.
That was the problem. You know, it's an enormous country, the America of 1775. It has a very long seaboard. We never at any time had more than about 35,000 troops in operations. And so it was never going to be anything like enough. That said, only about a third of Americans were active supporters of the revolution. Another third supported Britain, and another third wanted nothing to do with the warfare at all, and sort of essentially stayed out of it until it was clear which side was winning.
Okay.
And that was a positive aspect as far as we were concerned. The other thing, of course, is that George Washington could very easily have been captured with his army in Manhattan. It was a fortunate escape. He had fog on the East River and so on. There are moments in history where luck plays an important part, and you do see that in the American Revolution.
Notwithstanding the good fortune that George Washington and indeed his army had on occasions, is he really, would you say, an indispensable figure in the American effort?
Certainly, because he kept the Continental Army together at Valley Forge.
Okay.
That's the key moment, that winter. And
which year was this?
1776 to 77, where you have to essentially, whenever it's war gamed, basically it's Washington keeping the army together and as a fighting force at that point that makes the difference. Demoralization was only steps away, but his leadership and his personal qualities were absolutely indispensable.
And here, are we talking primarily about his power as a kind of morale-boosting figurehead, or sort of tactical and operational skill, or all three?
Well, I mean, he showed tactical and operational skill. Of course, he did. The crossing of the Delaware, the attacks on the Hessians, and so on. You know, these are brave and bold manoeuvres, which is something that all leaders, military leaders, need to be able to do. But more than that, I think it was his personality, his charisma, his courage were enough for people to undergo terrible privations. You get it again with Napoleon in his opening campaign, in the Italian campaign in 1796. You know, it is extraordinary what people will put up with if A, they trust and believe in their leaders, and B, ultimately they think they're going to be victorious.
Yes.
The moment where you have got problems is when the leaders show that they're not up to it, or people just think they're definitely going to lose, and so they might as well go home.
Could we have done more, the British I mean, to try and forge deeper military links with loyalists in the United States itself? Because one of the points you make in your biography of George III is that the real tyrant of the late 18th century was no British king, it was distance itself, and that was obviously a major disadvantage to the British, because it took us 6 to 8 weeks to get any of the information that had been going on 6 or 8 weeks ago. And of course, Americans were able to respond quickly and deftly to events because it was their backyard. Could we have forged closer links?
Not just information, of course, but also supplies.
Indeed, yes.
We should have had a viceroy on the spot in New York, controlling everything.
Which was very loyalist, New York, wasn't it?
Yes, and to have had Lord George Germain back in London making these strategic decisions was absurd. There needed to be a commander-in-chief on the spot, and also, of course, partly because, as you say, the war, at least initially, was fought in a humane way. I mean, there were town burnings and atrocities later on, but because they started off in a humane way, they either had to buy supplies and food and forage and so on from the Americans, or had to ship it over from England, which of course was thousands of miles away.
Of course, yeah.
The other great problem was that, of course, it can't be seen just in and of itself. One has to see the war in a global context. And after the defeat at Saratoga, you have the French declaring war in 1778.
On the side of the Americans.
The Spanish in 1779 and the Dutch in 1780. So suddenly, Britain, instead of just fighting in America, is fighting in India, the West Indies, the Mediterranean, and all over the world, essentially.
Yes. Yeah, and one thing that you mention in your book on George III is that one positive aspect of the French in particular declaring on the American side is that it created much more support for the war at home, because people were not particularly, it's much more appetizing for Englishmen to fight Frenchmen than it is for them to fight their own English cousins, transatlantic cousins.
Very much. I mean, there were lots of very pro-American radical Whigs
Yes.
in Parliament, Charles James Fox being a classic example, who hated this war, and many of the generals were Whigs. The Howe brothers didn't much like the war, neither did Gage. In fact, it's quite difficult to find a British general. Bannister Tarleton is one who actually wanted to fight this in a sort of harsh, vicious, and bitter way. Most of the rest of them wanted to win, of course, but not in a way that was going to alienate the Americans forever.
But nevertheless, the morale boost that did follow at home, that did follow fast on the heels of the French declaration on the side of the Americans, was not enough to offset the way in which we were, like, it was a good thing in the sense that it boosted morale, but it was a bad thing in the sense that it stacked the decks against the British even more so. So it didn't really offset the problems you listed earlier about fighting a global war.
Partly because they weren't going to fight total war. You don't have total war really until the First World War, where the whole of society is mobilised. And the second thing is that in the naval sphere, which ultimately was the thing that lost us the war, was the fact that Cornwallis wasn't able to be evacuated from Yorktown, and that happened because de Grasse was there with the French fleet.
Yes.
And so ultimately it was catastrophic for us. One thing to remember, of course, is that, ironically enough, in the way that history always works with irony, it was also catastrophic for the French, because they spent so much money on the American Revolution that they were bankrupt by 1789, and it cost the king his head.
And not even a resourceful Swissman like Monsieur Necker could do much about that insolvency crisis, and the rest is history.
Exactly.
In the French case.
An iron law of unintended consequences.
Indeed. Always being on guard against those. Are there plausible counterfactuals in which the war never happens because we appease the colonists in a convincing enough fashion in either the 1760s or the early 1770s? For instance, it was actually suggested, as you know, by some American colonists, not least Ben Franklin, but also a lesser-known figure called James Otis, that the King George III, should separate his British crown from his colonial crown and govern as America's effective constitutional monarch through the equivalent of some kind of American parliament. Because it wasn't, as I understand it, until after the Boston what do they call it? Tea Party and the intolerable acts, as they call it, or what do we call it, the coercive acts that followed, that the king himself actually became quite unpopular in the Americas. Were there options open for George III?
Certainly there were. There were. The other one, of course, was not to have the proclamation which closed off the westward move of the colonies into Ohio and further west. That was essentially telling the American colonists that they were only ever going to be along the eastern seaboard. It would, of course, have broken our series of alliances with Native American tribes, and that would have been harsh. But nonetheless, if the whole of the there were an awful lot of founding fathers, of course, who had money, speculative money invested, including George Washington, in this moved westwards, which was ended in 1763. If that's classic contingency, is if all of that energy, instead of being directed against Britain, was directed in this massive move westwards, which of course did take place as soon as the Americans had won that war, then it might not have happened at all.
Why did George III and indeed his ministers not pursue those possibilities?
Because they reckon that they had treaties signed in good faith with the Native American tribes during what the Americans call the French Indian War, and we call the 7 Years' War.
Why did we not pursue this? Why did George III not pursue the strategy of governing as the effective constitutional monarch of America through an American equivalent of Parliament that would have cut off at the root the no taxation without representation grievance?
Because he was a constitutional monarch and he did what the governments of the day said, and the governments of the day reckoned that they needed money back from the huge amounts that they'd spent in the French and Indian Wars protecting the American colonies.
Yes.
And there were financial crises all the way through the 1760s and early 1770s, and a big open-handed, open-hearted gesture like that was something that unfortunately was beyond any of the very substandard prime ministers. He had 14 prime ministers in his reign, only 2 of which were any good, and they were the father and son, of course, of the Pitts.
Indeed. And you trace the legacy and magnitude of the fact that the Americans did break away from the British eventually at the Treaty of Paris in 1783, very far into the future, and you believe that it's very possible that the First World War, which seems like a distant event relative to the late 18th century, but it probably would not have happened if the English-speaking peoples had remained politically united. Why do you think that?
Well, the Kaiser isn't going to invade Belgium if he knows he's going to have to fight America and the whole of the British Empire. It wouldn't cross his mind. He'd be insane to have done such a thing. So you don't get the First World War if America and Britain stay as a single political entity, a condominium, as it were. The Hanoverians would probably have had to have moved over to America when it became clearly the great power of the world. I imagine the 1860s, 70s, 80s, they'd have decamped over. They hadn't been in England for very long.
No, indeed.
Anyhow, they'd only been in England for half a century or so. So it wouldn't have been the end of the world for them. And there are plenty of other precedents for royal families moving, upwards. And that's what they would have done. If you hadn't had the First World War, then you wouldn't have had the Second World War, Nazism, the Holocaust and so on. The world would be a much happier place.
Yes. Well, let's move on to Napoleon, who is a great hero of yours. Slightly
less now, funnily enough. Because of the present book that I'm writing, Napoleon and his marshals, the way he treated his marshals makes me admire Napoleon less than I did when I wrote my biography of 2014.
I see. So Napoleon the Great with a slight footnote now.
Yeah, the Napoleon the Not So Great.
Okay. I see. Okay. Well, nevertheless, do you agree with most of your fellow Napoleon historians in believing that the real turning point that went against his fortunes in the Napoleonic Wars was his 1812 Russia campaign?
Oh, I can get it even much more compact than that.
All right.
It was the 25th of October, 1812, when at the time of the Battle of Maloyaroslavets, about 75 miles southwest of Moscow, he decided to take the wrong route, essentially a big dog-led route to Smolensk that meant that he had to go back via the battlefield of Borodino. And only a few days later, 8 days or so later, the blizzard started. Now, if he'd instead pushed on to go south towards Kaluga, he'd have avoided the bad weather, saved the Grande Armée, and would have not had to fight any of the battles of 1813, which essentially led to his abdication in 1814.
Did he know that these options were available to him? Did he have marshals who were advising him to take this tact? Or is this something that historians have...
All his marshals were against pushing on.
Right.
But the thing about Napoleon is he never really listened terribly much to his marshals. He hadn't taken their advice when it came to going to Moscow. And he left enough time, in fact, he left more time to get from Moscow to Smolensk than he had going from Smolensk to Moscow. So it's not fair on him to say that he didn't know that the Russian winters were very cold. Of course he did. He was a highly intelligent man. He'd read the almanacs and he'd read Voltaire and so on. So there's no... he knew about Charles XII of Sweden. So, these kind of mono-explanations don't work really with Napoleon.
We'll give people a bit of background on this. The main reason why he was bothering going anywhere near Russia in the first place was because he wanted to enforce his continental system, as it was then called, the effective customs union, I think it's fair to say.
It was a protectionist
customs union
attempt to ensure that Britain was cut out of all markets in Europe.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but he believed that, so the Tsar at the time was Tsar Alexander I, the young Tsar, and he had an agreement with Napoleon, I think stemming from the Tilsit meeting in 1807.
And also the Erfurt meeting in 1808.
In 1808, that Russia would abide by this continental system and would not let British imports come in, because that would be economically beneficial to the British, who had been fighting largely an economic war against Napoleon since Trafalgar.
Long before.
Earlier than Trafalgar.
1790.
Indeed, yes, of course. So what were the Russians doing, and why did he think that the way to bring them to heel was a full-scale invasion? Why did he not pursue diplomatic means to achieve that?
Well, he'd already defeated the Russians twice, of course, in the 1805 and 1807 campaigns.
Yes.
He was over-optimistic, of course, but nonetheless, the number of troops that he used to invade Russia was enormous. It was the same size as Paris, about 600,000 men. The Russians only had 250,000 men. He wasn't intending to go all the way to Moscow. He was originally intending only to go about 50 miles in a 3-week campaign. So he was sucked in to Russia by the brilliant Russian generalship, and this
is Kutuzov?
No, he wasn't in charge until a bit later.
Bagration?
It was Bagration was one of them, and the Tsar himself was very much in favour of this, and Bennigsen. The major Russian generals, the only person who really opposed it and wanted a big battle was Kutuzov.
Right.
But when you have this campaign on this kind of magnitude, it does sometimes come down to individual personal decisions. And Napoleon, as I say, didn't listen to his marshals at Smolensk when he decided to go on to Moscow, which is another classic example of why the determinists and the Marxists and the Whigs are wrong. Because if it does actually come down to a decision of one great man or woman in history, what happens, then there is nothing determinist about it, really.
Should he have? Why did he not just park himself in Central Europe, and in order to maintain greater supply lines? Because, as I understand it, most of the French members of the Grande Armée who perished in this Russia campaign did so through diseases, probably in many cases avoidable diseases.
Well, typhus in particular. That was the killer in the central thrusting corps that were going towards Moscow. You had other things that killed people in throughout the whole campaign, of course. But the real killer was disease. It's a horrible disease, typhus. What essentially happens is that a little sort of creature eats into your skin, a sort of louse, essentially, and then dies there, and then you die 3 or 4 days later in immense pain. Horrible.
But should he have predicted that spreading his supply lines so thinly over such a vast distance, and eventually, obviously, he even got to Moscow himself, and I believe spent 36 days there with his Grande Armée. The Russians sort of tactically retreated into the countryside, and he was spread too thin.
Well, the Russians had lost the Battle of Borodino, so they had to give up.
Indeed. But I mean, was it not predictable? I find it surprising that a man with the kind of tactical and strategic skill of Napoleon that he demonstrated in so many of his battles would not have realised that spreading your supply lines thinly in this way would lead to these sorts of second-order losses.
He'd been to Cairo, he'd been to Vienna twice, he'd been to Madrid. Now, he knew what long supply lines were like.
Okay.
And he did have enormous amounts of supplies, which was the other great factor. But no, you're right, he didn't factor in the partisans that would cut the supply lines, Cossacks and so on. But it wasn't really that that was the reason that he went on to Moscow. It was that he did believe that, and understandably, because this has happened in all his earlier campaigns, that once he captured the enemy capital, the enemy would make peace.
Right.
But what he didn't take into account was, of course, the Russians have two capitals, and Tsar Alexander stayed in St. Petersburg and just essentially sort of shrugged, didn't reply to his peace overtures, and waited for the winter to close in. So it was, as I say, a brilliant manoeuvre by the Russians.
How important was it that the Russians didn't continue their strategy of tactical retreat and did take a definitive stand at the Battle of Borodino, just before they got into Moscow?
Well, the Russians fought extremely well in all of these battles. They wear Napoleon down in all the big battles, Krasnoy and Smolensk and so on, and that's essentially what Borodino is as well. It's a unbelievably bloody battle. It's the biggest and bloodiest battle in the history of the world up until that point. It's the equivalent of a fully loaded jumbo jet 747 crash landing and killing everybody every single 5 minutes of a 12-hour battle. So by the end of it, although Napoleon can claim it as a victory because Kutuzov withdrew afterwards back beyond Moscow, actually it was pretty much a Pyrrhic victory because of the number of men he lost.
And trace exactly the ways in which this 25th of October, as you put it, really did sort of precipitate Napoleon's later downfall, and kind of marked the end of a great series of successes.
Yes, I mean, he took the wrong decision. Out of many thousands of decisions that he took in that campaign, he decided instead of going south of pushing on south and pushing Kutuzov back. Actually, the great irony, of course, again, law of unintended consequences, Kutuzov wasn't even on the road, wasn't going to be contesting the road, had left the road south. So Napoleon would have been able to have taken the Grande Armée south pretty much unattacked. And so you wouldn't have got the horrors of the crossing of the Berezina in the early November of 1812. You wouldn't have got the collapse, the true horrors, including cannibalism, which the French army had to face.
Do you think that Napoleon should have been, obviously he wanted his continental system to have as much integrity and continent-wide staying power as possible for obvious strategic reasons, to do with his antipathy to the British and Britain's antipathy to him, but do you think he should have just effectively shrugged his shoulders and accepted that the Russians weren't going to enforce this maximally and spared himself the ordeals of this very, very damaging, hemorrhaging campaign?
Oh, what he should have done is to have read Wealth of Nations and to have recognised that protectionism doesn't work,
right,
to have fought made his own industrial revolution, and to have sold French goods at a cheaper cost than British goods, and thereby actually, win the economic war fair and square. That's what he should have done.
The Thatcherite route to victory.
Precisely. That way he'd have saved himself two things. Firstly, the invasion of Portugal, which turned into a disaster once the lines of Torres Vedras meant that Wellington could always retreat and could not be flung out of Portugal, and which then drew him into Spain. He lost 250,000 men in the Iberian Peninsula. You add that to the 500,000 men that he lost in Russia, entirely for protectionist reasons. If instead he'd gone down the proper Thatcherite route of just beating the British at their own game, then he'd have been happy we'd have had a Bonapartist on the throne of France today.
Yeah, so he suffered through being too much a dirigiste Frenchman.
Well, it's called Colbertism, and everyone was completely enthralled to it. So was George III and his ministers, of course, with the American Revolution. We did not allow the Americans to trade with anyone other than Britain, which caused an enormous amount of trouble, especially with the rum exports in the West Indies and so on. If we had allowed the Americans to trade with whoever they liked, they wouldn't have been so infuriated by 1775.
So about 120 years later, Hitler lands one of the most formidable invasions in world history, June 1941, 22nd of June, I think, 1941, mobilizing more than 3.8 million Wehrmacht troops to conquer Bolshevik Russia in violation of the Nazi-Soviet pact that had been signed a couple of years earlier. Out of interest, initially, we're talking about the importance of history and the importance of studying history, counterfactual history. I think as Churchill once said, the further you can look back, the further you can look forward. Did Hitler and indeed some of his generals, who were, I think you think were more skilled than Hitler was as a kind of war maker, study Napoleon's failures and try to learn from them?
Well, clearly not. Otherwise, they wouldn't have chosen the same day to attack Russia. I mean, that really was a very. If ever you in history have moments where someone should be tapped on the shoulder and said, "Look, read your history."
Do it tomorrow.
That clearly, the choice of the 22nd of June, which was the same day that the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen in 1812, should have been one of them. Napoleon actually got to Moscow, did take Moscow, which Hitler didn't do. He did it with oxen and horses, whereas Hitler had the opportunity of using mechanized
warfare
vehicles. It's very much a more impressive operation in general, really. But in terms of sheer size, yes, the Operation Barbarossa was, of course, the largest invasion in the history of mankind.
So, but did maybe they drew the wrong conclusions from it? But did they care about their military history? Particularly, you talk about men like Rundstedt and men like Manstein, like Hitler's main generals, Keitel, Hans Guderian. These are major figures who, as military strategists, if not as men, I know you admire. Do you think did they see it as?
I don't admire them as men, may I point that out?
I said, no, as strategists.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
As masters and commanders.
Yes, that's right, as masters and commanders. But
I was trying to make that clear,
yes,
sorry.
No, do let's underline that.
Did they study it, and did they care about military history and as a basis for their projects?
A lot of them actually had been at Staff College, and they and of course they knew their history. The problem was Nazism was the concept of the political concept, the ideological concept, which the Nazi leaders genuinely believed that because the Russians were Slavs, they weren't going to be able to put up a fight. Goebbels said, "We'll kick in the door and the whole rotten edifice will come down."
Yes.
And that was just racist, frankly. They felt the same way about America. They thought that America was ruled by blacks and Jews. They clearly hadn't looked very carefully at the actual personnel of the Roosevelt administration. And they thought that, therefore, the Aryan super race would be able to take on both Russia and America and the British Empire all at the same time and defeat them. It was all completely insane stuff, of course, but driven not by a deep knowledge of history, but instead by a sort of mad belief in racial superiority.
Do you think that hubris that they had, which is of course informed by their racialist ideology, that hubris was somewhat reinforced by the fact that they did have pretty resounding successes in the early part of Operation Barbarossa?
Well, no, and the early part of the Second World War,
Oh, of course,
because their swift victory over the Poles made them think that they were superior to the non-Aryan Poles.
Indeed.
And then their very big and quick victory in France made them think they were superior to the Latin peoples. And so by the time, and they'd done well in Greece and Yugoslavia, and they'd knocked out those countries in a matter of weeks as well. And so by the time they were about to invade Russia, they even sort of sensible generals had started to think that they were just impossible to beat.
So who were these sensible generals, and what were they recommending that Hitler did? Because of course they were. You've written a book about the Second World War called The Storm of War, and one of your central arguments, I would say, in that book is that Hitler was constantly prioritizing dogmatic, inflexible obedience to Nazi ideology over the best strategic interests of the Wehrmacht. And you argue that many of his generals were much better at seeing what those interests were, and Hitler was much too drunk on Nazi ideology to see good sense. What would good sense have seen him do? And what were his generals recommending?
Not invading
at all.
Yeah, Fritz Halder was against the
Really?
Invasion, but he was ignored.
Okay.
There was no need to invade Russia. Russia was actually, at the time, supplying Germany very heavily. What he should have done instead was to have knocked the British out of Egypt,
Okay.
to have taken control of the Suez Canal, and essentially to have won the war like that. And then when he did attack, the idea of marching thousands of miles across towards Moscow, again, was probably the wrong way of going about it. What they should have done is gone into the Caucasus and cut off 80% of Russian oil supply by doing that. Again, you know, this is a counterfactual, but counterfactuals matter because they remind people that all of these leaders had alternatives, that they were weighing up alternatives and they were deciding on the course of action that they ultimately took. But there were other courses of action. And I think if we forget that and just assume and just take for granted that they were only interested in the course that they ultimately took, it's much less of an honest appraisal, essentially, of what happened in the past.
Do you think so? One of the points you make in your book, The Storm of War, you say the central statistic of the war is the fact that for every 5 Germans that were killed on the battlefield, 4 of them were killed by the Soviets, by the Red Army.
Killed on the Eastern Front.
On the Eastern Front,
exactly.
indeed.
Yeah. So what the British and Americans and Canadians were doing was essentially killing the 5th German.
Yes.
Which was important, of course it was, and also the immense contributions that the Western Allies made to the Russian war effort with regard to the Arctic convoys and what was coming in via Persia. Thousands of planes, thousands of tanks, most of the trucks that brought the Red Army to Berlin were American made. 51 million pairs of boots. You know, this is a major contribution which President Putin will never admit to, and they always ignore and elide. But actually, it was very important. The most important thing was to keep the Wehrmacht, or at least 30% of the Wehrmacht, in the West to protect against the combined bomber offensive of Britain and America, which meant that the Soviets had to deal with the other 70%. But that's a huge difference from 100%.
Yes, and I think one of the points you make is that if we're sort of weighing up the contributions of the different Allied powers, whereas the Soviets undoubtedly donated the most in terms of blood and in terms of manpower, killing
by a massive
Germans,
factor,
by a massive magnitude.
Yeah.
The Americans were hugely influential in providing material. Like FDR made good on his promise to turn America into the arsenal of democracy in the speech he made, I think, in January 1942, just after Pearl Harbor had happened. And the British donated time and intelligence capabilities, not least through our programs at Bletchley Park.
And the naval, the naval situation, which meant that by the August of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had been won, and so all of the men and equipment necessary for the American push on D-Day could be brought over.
And so, do you think then that without the Russian contribution, it's fair to say that Hitler, one way or another, would have won the Second World War?
Well, it would have been a very different war, of course, because I think we would have been knocked out of Africa, or at least northern Africa, and we would have, on the assumption that Hitler had also managed to get more U-boats. This was another big problem. He started off the war with 95 operational U-boats and ended it with over 600. If it would have been the other way round, we would have been strangled in this island, and he could have just forced us to capitulate through starvation.
So, if the primary reason why Hitler lost the war is because he was, as you put it, an unregenerate Nazi, and that, as you have just illustrated, radically informed his strategy for fighting fighting the Russians because he viewed them as Slav.
Well, and also, more importantly, the Americans who do ultimately come up with the nuclear weapon, along with British and Polish scientists, that ends the Second World War. And he, as though it's almost a trivial thing, declared war against the Americans on the 11th of December 1941, a country that's uninvadable, which he didn't understand, which none of the Nazis apart from Ribbentrop had ever visited, which had a productive capacity that was able to knock out a Liberty ship every day. I mean, it was an unbelievable ignorance error for him to have made.
And is it also the case that Heinrich Himmler wanted, the head of the SS, arguably the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, arguably, wanted to make greater use of tactical alliances with other Slavic peoples, not least the Ukrainians, who hated Stalin for very good reason, and that Nazi ideology rather prevented the Nazis from capitalizing on that anti-Stalinist discontent that was in the Soviet fringe and could indeed have been mobilized against the Red Army.
Absolutely. When they went into Ukraine and parts of Belarus, the leaders of the village would come with bread and salt, the traditional welcome. And instead of setting up independent, semi-independent Slavic states, they just treated them all as helots, and worse, obviously, with regard to the Einsatzgruppen and so on. So you have an entire sort of assumption of this racial superiority, which wasn't going to go down well with Russian partisans.
Yes. You have I think in your most recent book, correct me if I'm wrong because you churn them out at a rapid pace, but your most recent book is Conflict with General Petraeus?
Sweet of you. I spent 6 years on my Napoleon book and 6 years on my Salisbury book. I will have done 3 years on this present book. I wouldn't say it's a machine gun.
You churn out big books at a rapid pace, perhaps, put it that way. Petraeus, the book Conflict is your latest?
That's right, yes. I wouldn't say it was churned out, but nonetheless, yes, all right.
And I suppose, so that is, it looks into the evolution of warfare from 1945 to today. War is constantly evolving, not least because technology is constantly evolving. Are you of the view that, nevertheless, despite all this, and despite what we're increasingly seeing in Russia, Ukraine, with drone warfare being used, like very interesting, sort of cutting-edge tactics, and for some of it, much of it, very, very scary, that the fundamentals of war never really change?
Yes, well, it's very interesting that in Ukraine at the moment, for the first time in history, more people are being killed by drones than by shells. And what the last chapter 10 of that book, Conflict, that I wrote with David, was about was the future of war, cyber, space, robotics, AI, drones, obviously, sensors, all sorts of areas which are essentially getting faster and faster. The exponential speed of the evolution of warfare is completely nerve-wracking. And you've got to be at the absolute cutting edge if you're going to win, because in the years to come we will have fighter jets that are not manned, which will be shooting down ones that are. We'll have drones that can operate entirely on their own, even against electromagnetic pulses, and shoot down other drones. And idea of a war between satellites in space is something that is no longer science fiction. And so the key thing, of course, is to be always at the cutting edge. Otherwise, you're going to lose.
And nevertheless, though, you don't think that the fact that we are engaged in an escape velocity from comfort, in some ways, in terms of the radical way in which technology is evolving, means that the study of history is obsolete for the future's military commanders?
The driving emotions and forces behind commanders are exactly the same as they were in the times of Thucydides and 5th century Athens. Nothing like that has changed. But the thing is that it was not going to be humans who are going to be the deciding factors. It's going to be algorithms, which admittedly have been written by humans, but they only need to be very slightly wrong in order to be catastrophic for humanity.
Lord Robert, thank you.
Thank you. You've certainly ended on a rather downward point, but nonetheless, it's another good reason to study history.
Well, just to darken things even further, it is said that only the dead see the end of war. Do you believe that to be the case?
Undoubtedly, yes. It's unfortunately part of the human condition. If we can change human nature, then maybe things would be better. But yes, the other rather depressing but really apposite line comes from Leon Trotsky, who said that you might not be interested in war, but war's interested in you.
Indeed so. So we better pay attention. Lord Roberts, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.